History is not a record of what happened. It is a record of what survived, and sometimes, what survives is only the deafening silence left behind by an event too terrifying to write down. If you walk through the military archives of Western Europe, you will find miles of paper. Every bullet rationed, every soldier fed, every grave dug. The bookkeeping of the First World War was an industrial machine all its own, cataloguing the deaths of millions with cold, mathematical precision. Yet, if you look for the joint Allied maneuver scheduled for November of 1917 in an isolated sector of the French Alps, the paperwork simply stops. It does not trail off. It is cleanly severed. On November 12th, 3,000 men were camped in a remote valley. By November 15th, they had ceased to exist. They were not killed in action. They did not desert. They were simply erased. To understand how 3,000 soldiers could vanish from the face of the earth, we must first understand the breaking point of the modern world. The year 1917 was a nightmare of mud and steel. The Great War had been raging for 3 years, and the generals of Europe had exhausted their strategies, their resources, and their young men. The battlefields were no longer places of tactical brilliance. They were meat grinders. The French army was facing widespread mutinies. Whole divisions were refusing to march into the fire. The British were bleeding out in the flooded craters of Passchendaele. The Americans had just entered the conflict, bringing fresh bodies but no miraculous solutions. The military high commands were utterly desperate. They did not need a better rifle or a faster tank. They needed a weapon that could break the endless stalemate without requiring thousands of men to run across an open field into the teeth of machine gun fire. This profound desperation bred a dangerous kind of open-mindedness within the war departments. The heavy oak doors of military intelligence were suddenly thrown open to fringe scientists, eccentric engineers, and theorists, whose ideas would have been laughed out of the room just a decade earlier. If a chemist claimed he could invent a gas that put an entire trench to sleep permanently, he was given a laboratory. If a physicist claimed he could harness the power of the weather, he was given funding. It is within this shadow world of classified, unregulated wartime research that we find the first whispers of Project Echo, or, as it was referred to in the few fragmented civilian train manifests that survived the purge, the harmonic vanguard. The early 20th century was a time of invisible wonders. Radio waves were suddenly carrying voices across oceans. X-rays were looking through human tissue. The world was waking up to the fact that the air around us was filled with invisible forces that could be manipulated. Prominent inventors like Nikola Tesla had already demonstrated that mechanical resonance could cause localized, artificial earthquakes. The theory was beautifully simple but devastating in its implications. If you could find the exact resonant frequency of a physical object, you could shake it to pieces using remarkably little energy. The military asked a logical, horrifying question. Could this invisible physics be applied to a battlefield? Could engineers build a machine that broadcast a low-frequency hum, an infrasound wave, that would cause enemy trenches to spontaneously collapse? Or worse, could they find the resonant frequency of the human nervous system itself? The theoretical goal of Project Echo was not to kill the enemy with shrapnel or fire, but to disorient them so completely that they could no longer hold a weapon. A silent, invisible wave of acoustic pressure that would roll across no man's land, causing instant vertigo, debilitating nausea, and mass unconsciousness. It would be the ultimate weapon, a bloodless victory achieved through the manipulation of the atmosphere. By late October 1917, a highly classified unit was quietly assembled to test this theory. They were officially designated as the 204th Provisional Engineering Brigade, but they were not normal engineers. The unit was comprised of 3,000 men, handpicked from different Allied regiments. There were British acoustical experts, French logistics officers, and a large contingent of American infantrymen sent primarily to act as the biological test subjects in the outer blast radius. They were sent to Sector 42, a remote, heavily forested valley in the Vosges Mountains, near the border of France and Germany. It was a perfectly quiet sector, far from the constant artillery barrages of the Western Front. The valley was shaped like a deep, natural bowl, making it a perfect topographical amphitheater for trapping and observing massive sound waves. For 2 weeks, the locals of the nearby civilian village of Sainte Marguerite watched strange, unmarked trains arrive in the dead of night. These trains were not carrying standard troops or grain rations. They were carrying massive, tarpaulin-covered machines. Villagers described seeing electrical generators the size of small houses. They saw huge metallic dishes that looked like early radar equipment, but mounted on heavy iron pivots and aimed directly at the ground instead of the sky. The village was immediately placed under strict martial law. Curfews were brutally enforced by foreign soldiers. The windows facing the valley were ordered to be boarded up and painted black. But you cannot hide a disturbance in the fabric of nature. The locals noticed the changes. History gives us glimpses of the truth through the diaries of ordinary people. The journal of a local French postmaster, named Henry Laurent, provides the most chilling account of the days leading up to the Great Experiment. On November 10th, Laurent wrote that all the dogs in the village had begun to whine incessantly, scratching at the doors to be let inside, only to cower under the furniture. By November 11th, the birds had completely vanished from the trees. The surrounding forest, usually alive with the rustling sounds of late autumn, went completely and unnaturally dead. Then came the physiological sensations. Laurent described a constant feeling of heavy pressure in his ears, likening it to the sensation of diving too deep underwater. Healthy people in the village began to suffer from severe, unexplainable nosebleeds. Pocket compasses stopped pointing north, instead spinning sluggishly in endless circles. The air itself took on a strange quality, tasting sharply of copper and heavy static electricity. Whatever the 24th Brigade was building down in that isolated valley, it was already leaking invisible energy into the surrounding landscape. The military had tapped into a frequency they did not understand, and they were preparing to turn the dial all the way up. The full-scale test was scheduled for the early hours of November 14, 1917. The atmospheric conditions were supposedly perfect. A heavy, unusually dense fog had rolled into the valley off the mountains, trapping the cold air and creating a sealed, natural acoustic chamber. At exactly 2 in the morning, the massive generators were activated. We do not know exactly what happened on the floor of the valley, because not a single man who was down there ever came back to tell us. But we know exactly what the villagers 3 miles away experienced. According to multiple preserved accounts from Sainte-Marguerite, a sound began to build in the darkness. It was not a loud, explosive noise. It was a low, subaudible hum. It was a frequency felt rather than heard. It vibrated the glass in the window frames. It rattled the ceramic teacups in the cupboards. The vibration was so deep and resonant that it traveled through the stone foundations of the houses, through the soles of their shoes, and directly into their bones. Then, the thick fog resting over the valley began to glow. Witnesses described a pale, sickly blue light illuminating the mist from within, pulsing in perfect time with the deep, rhythmic hum. The physical vibration increased in intensity until people in the village were physically falling to their knees, clutching their heads in agony. The pressure inside their skulls was unbearable. Several accounts state that it felt as though gravity itself was momentarily shifting, pulling them sideways instead of down. And then, at precisely 2:15 in the morning, the nightmare stopped. The hum abruptly ceased. The blue light vanished entirely. The valley was instantly plunged back into total, suffocating darkness and absolute silence. The sudden absence of sound and pressure was so shocking that it woke those few who had somehow managed to sleep through the terrifying build-up. The villagers waited in the dark. They expected to hear the sounds of thousands of men cheering a successful test. They expected to hear the terrible roar of an accidental explosion, or at least the mechanical rumble of the massive generators winding down. Nothing came, just the cold November wind moving quietly through the pine trees. At dawn, a heavily armed convoy of high-ranking Allied officers and scientific observers arrived at the outer perimeter of the valley. They were there to observe the medical and structural results of the harmonic test. They fully expected to find the 3,000 men of the 204th Brigade recovering from extreme disorientation, perhaps nursing ruptured eardrums or severe nausea, but fundamentally alive. The convoy drove past the first outer checkpoint. It was completely abandoned. The wooden boom gate was raised, and the sentry box was empty. The guard's standard-issue rifle was still leaning against the wooden wall. His half-smoked cigarette was resting on the windowsill, completely burned down to the filter, leaving a perfect, undisturbed cylinder of ash. Feeling the first pangs of dread, the convoy proceeded down the dirt road into the valley floor. driving directly into the heart of the massive encampment. What they found defied all logic, physics, and reason. The military camp was in absolutely perfect condition. The heavy canvas tents were neatly pitched and tied down. The field kitchens were still smoking, with large iron cauldrons of morning porridge slowly burning to the bottom of their pots. The massive experimental generators were sitting in the exact center of the camp, completely silent, their massive copper coils cold to the touch. But the men were gone. 3,000 seasoned soldiers. Gone. The investigators frantically scoured the area. There were no signs of a struggle. There was no blood on the frost-covered grass. There were no bodies dragged into the woods. The armory tents were fully stocked with thousands of rounds of ammunition, completely untouched. The cavalry and transport horses were still securely tied to their posts, though they were highly agitated, covered in white sweat, and kicking at the dirt. Inside the main command tent, the strategic maps were still spread out on the heavy wooden tables. A tin cup of coffee sat near the edge of a map, a thin, delicate film of ice having formed over the top of the dark liquid. The brigade commander's silver pocket watch was resting neatly on an open leather notebook. It had stopped ticking at exactly 2:15. 3,000 men had simply evaporated into the glowing fog. Imagine the sheer, unadulterated panic that must have erupted in the underground war rooms of Paris and London when the encrypted telegrams arrived. You cannot simply lose an entire brigade without a shot being fired. You cannot tell 3,000 grieving mothers and wives that their husbands vanished into thin air because of a classified acoustic experiment gone horribly wrong. The psychological morale of the Allied forces was already hanging by a microscopic thread. News of an invisible weapon that could instantly erase a small army would have caused mass panic in the trenches and likely triggered a full-scale military collapse. The decision was made instantly, and with ruthless efficiency. The 204th Brigade never existed. Project Echo never happened. The valley in the Vosges Mountains was permanently quarantined under the guise of an unexploded ordnance field. The vast bureaucratic machine of the Allied military was immediately turned inward, weaponized against its own history. Memos were incinerated in iron stoves. Supply ledgers were entirely rewritten by intelligence officers working in locked rooms. But how do you explain the sudden, permanent absence of 3,000 men to their families? You cannot say they died together because the location of their graves would be questioned. You must disperse them. Over the next 6 months, the military bureaucracy slowly and methodically reassigned the missing men on paper. They were phantom transfers. The vanished soldiers were officially absorbed into other infantry units that had recently suffered heavy, chaotic casualties. A dozen men assigned to a decimated regiment here, 50 men assigned to a ruined battalion there. Then, the official casualty reports were meticulously forged. The men of the 204th were listed as killed in action in battles they never actually fought in. Some were recorded as having fallen in the deep mud of Passchendaele. Others were listed as victims of a devastating German mustard gas attack near Ypres. Some were simply classified as missing in action during routine, nighttime trench patrols. The families eventually received the standard, heartbreaking telegrams bordered in black ink. They wept in their parlors. They accepted the official military pensions. They buried empty, symbolic coffins in their local churchyards. And the terrible secret of the glowing valley was buried right alongside them. For decades, the official, fabricated story held strong. The Great War finally ended. An even more devastating Second World War followed, and the strange, silent incident in the Vosges Mountains was thoroughly lost to time. But bureaucracy is a clumsy, imperfect creature. It is nearly impossible to perfectly erase the lives of 3,000 human beings. Mistakes are always made. Paperwork always slips through the cracks of the filing cabinets. In the late 1990s, independent historical researchers, unburdened by military allegiances, began to notice deeply unsettling anomalies in the surviving archives. They were looking at pension records, analyzing unit rosters, and digitally tracking the daily movements of Allied soldiers. They found impossible contradictions staring back at them from the yellowed paper. There were hundreds of individual soldiers whose official death certificates stated they died in the artillery-churned mud of Passchendaele in early October. Yet their own handwritten mail records, preserved in a different departmental archive, showed they had signed for winter rations and new boots in eastern France in early November. Dead men do not sign for boots. Researchers found fragmented logistics manifests sitting deep in the French National Archives, authorizing 3,000 heavy winter coats, thousands of pounds of flour, and massive industrial electrical cables to be delivered to a valley that, officially, held no troops and no strategic value. Perhaps the most haunting piece of physical evidence is a single, surviving photograph. It was found tightly folded inside a hollowed-out book in the estate of a British logistics officer after his death. It shows a sprawling military camp situated in a misty, forested valley. The hundreds of canvas tents are perfectly pitched. The strange, dish-like machinery is faintly visible in the background, towering over the supply crates. But the camp is entirely, utterly devoid of human life. There is not a single blur of motion, not a single face, not a single silhouette. On the back of the photograph, written in hurried, deeply nervous cursive ink, are 5 words. Where did they walk to? What actually happened to the men of the 204th Brigade on that freezing November morning? The most grounded, scientifically plausible explanation is that the experimental infrasound generators caused a mass, catastrophic psychological breakdown. Perhaps the intense acoustic pressure induced such severe paranoia, vertigo, and visual hallucinations that all 3,000 men lost their minds simultaneously. Driven entirely mad by the hum, they fled into the dense, freezing, unforgiving forests of the mountains, scattering in every direction, where they eventually succumbed to hypothermia. But if that logical theory were true, where are the bones? Why were their rifles neatly left behind in the armories? Why did not a single local villager, hunter, or forester ever find a frozen body in a uniform, or see a single wandering, traumatized soldier stumbling out of the tree line? Another military theory suggests the untested generators created a localized, intense electromagnetic event so powerful that it instantly incinerated the biological matter in the immediate vicinity, leaving the canvas tents and cold metal completely intact. But human bodies do not burn at a temperature high enough to leave absolutely no ash without destroying the environment around them. Humans do not simply disappear without leaving a stain on the earth. Then, there are the darker, far less scientific theories. Theories whispered by those who study the strange phenomena of the early 20th century. Theories that suggest the desperate generals of 1917 were experimenting with physical forces that were not merely acoustic or electrical. Forces that accidentally tore at the very fragile fabric of the physical world. A resonance that did not just vibrate the earth, but vibrated 3,000 men entirely out of alignment with our known reality. We will likely never know the complete truth. The generation of generals that blindly ordered the experiment is entirely dead. The terrified men who carried it out are gone forever. The archives have been so heavily sanitized over a century of secrecy, leaving only the ghosts of clerical errors to hint at the scale of the tragedy. Today, the valley near St. Margaret is breathtakingly quiet. The heavy forest has slowly reclaimed the clearing where the vast camp once stood. Hiking trails cut through the area. Tourists pass over the soil without ever knowing what happened beneath their boots. The birds have long since returned to the branches. The wind still moves through the dark pine trees, making a low, soft sound. But history is rarely as neat as the textbooks suggest. It is full of dark corners, locked doors, and missing pages. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was simply a series of terrible, cascading industrial accidents, subsequently buried by arrogant men who were deeply ashamed of their own failure. Or maybe, deep in the dust of the military archives, the silence is actively trying to tell us something. Maybe the people who lived through that terrifying night saw something we no longer possess the capacity to recognize. What actually happens when humanity pushes the invisible boundaries of the physical world too far? Does the world push back? And if 3,000 heavily armed men can be permanently erased from the face of the earth and the pages of recorded history with a single, silent frequency, who else has simply ceased to exist? What are your thoughts on what happened in that valley?